So for new arrivals, I'm Craig Bennett. I'm Chief Executive here at Friends of the Earth. I'm delighted to move us into the John Preedy Memorial Lecture. And I want to say, first of all, just a couple of words about John Preedy and this lecture. John Preedy was a very dedicated activist that worked with Friends of the Earth and other organisations in the 1980s. He was based in Cumberland and he was campaigning across a range of issues, particularly transport and nuclear power. Very dedicated, worked closely with communities and so on. And very sadly, he was killed as a cyclist, killed in a road accident in the late 1980s. So since then, to remember him, every year Friends of the Earth does the John Preedy Memorial Lecture at the conferences we had for years and over the last 4 or 5 years at base camp. And it's always to remember him there. And it's when we get some of the real sort of best speakers, the people in to really stretch our thinking and to enable us to think how we can constantly evolve as a network, as an organisation and as a movement. And so I'm delighted this year to introduce you to Hahrie Han. Harry's a political scientist from the University of California, where she's the Anton Vonk Associate Professor of Political Science. She specialises in the study of political participation, collective action, social change, democratic renewal, particularly in how it relates to environmental matters. She's written a number of books, this wonderful one here, How Organisations Develop Activists. And you know that when I started as Chief Exec, I said, I think for Friends of the Earth to really become the best it can possibly be, we absolutely have to live up to our name. We have to be Friends of the Earth. It's all about mobilising people, bringing people together and being as effective as we possibly can at the grassroots, in communities, reaching out to people that are Friends of the Earth, but they don't know it yet. And all of that, we need to really think how we can organise ourselves and be as effective as we possibly can. So we can think of no one better to come and tell us about all the latest thinking on that. Real evidence-based. Harry's been studying this in all kinds of organisations. And Hahrie, we're absolutely delighted to have you this morning and so excited to hear what you have to say. Welcome.
Try that again. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for being here this morning. I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all. So I really want to thank Friends of the Earth, Craig and Claire, and everyone who's been so helpful in organizing this visit. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to talk with you all today. Like Craig said, a lot of what I want to do today is talk about a lot of what we know about how movements get built. Like how does an organization like Friends of the Earth begin to sort of engage people in ways that actually build the momentum that we want to make the kind of change that we want to see. Before I get started, I find that it's usually helpful to start by talking about how I got into this work. And so I just wanted to start by doing that. I grew up in the United States, in Texas, which is a state in the southern part of the United States, as a daughter of Korean immigrants. My parents immigrated to the United States in 1973 from South Korea. My dad came from a family of Korean refugees. There's a great picture of them on the top there that you can't see. And you can see a little bit, okay. So that my grandparents were Korean refugees. They brought my father's family to the South, and then they eventually immigrated to the United States. And a lot of what I saw growing up was the effort that my parents made to try to figure out what it meant to raise kids in the U.S., right? And so when they first moved to the U.S., my mom cleaned people's houses, my dad delivered Chinese food on the back of his bike, and they tried to figure out how to make it. They did things like take us to Mount Rushmore because that's what they thought American kids did. We went and looked at presidents carved in stone, right? Because that's just what we do. And by the time that I left for college, I was the youngest in my family. My parents were able to move from the sort of working class neighborhood where I grew up into a pretty nice townhouse in one of the fancier neighborhoods in Houston. And I think that throughout that experience, even though my family was very apolitical, politics was not something that we talked about at home. Social change, social justice, those kind of things were not anything that was a part of my experience growing up. I think I grew up with this sense that even if we're not talking about politics, this whole idea of transformation, of transforming who we are as people, is part of what it means to be a human being, right? So I grew up with this idea that transformation is not only possible, it's a way of life. And so I think it's no accident then that a lot of what I do is I study social movements, right? I try to understand how movements work. And the reason why I think it's no accident is because what appealed to me about social movements when I first began to get involved in organizing as a college student in the United States is that movements are different from other efforts to try to make change because they work through transformation, right? The fundamental way in which a movement works is by transforming what people think is possible, right? So it's different from a company that's trying to sell you ketchup, right? Or trying to sell you cereal or something like that, because they're not trying to sell you a product that you already want, but instead what they're trying to do is change what's possible in the world that we can envision together. So what I want to do today is talk about three things, right? And so I'm going to tell you right now what I'm going to say. Okay, so there are three things I want to talk about, right? Power, transformation, and love, right? And so here are the 3 points that I want to make. The first is that the kinds of problems that we come together to try to work on are fundamentally problems of power, right? And so we have to understand power in order to be able to understand how to make the change that we want, right? So that's the first point. The second point is that the way that you build power is through transformation, right? Unless you're thinking about how to transform the people that you want to engage, you're not going to build the kind of power that you want, right? And the third point that I want to make is the kind of power and the kind of transformation that we need to make is fundamentally rooted in love, right? And so we have to recognize the love that's at the core of what we're trying to do. So power, transformation, and love, all right? You guys with me? Okay, so let's start with power. Okay, so why power, right? Why am I talking about power on this beautiful sunny day, right, in England? Okay, so whenever we think about the kind of problems that we're trying to work on, the first question to ask is why are those problems, right? Like why is it that environmental problems have been so sticky, right? Why is it that problems of economic inequality or any of these other problems that we might think about in our world are so hard to solve? Right? And the point that I want to make is that when we think about sort of our understanding of why the problem is a problem, that leads us to the kind of solution that we might envision, right? And so implicit in all the solutions that we envision for the problems that we have is an assumption, right, or a theory of change about what the sort of source of that problem is. Does that make sense to you guys? And so if we think about the different approaches that people use, right, let's say if people can just kind of call out some examples, what are different solutions to, like, as you guys think about different social problems that you all face, Brexit, okay, environmental issues, climate change, you know, I'm from California, so water issues are always very prevalent, right? Whatever it is that we might think about, what are the kind of solutions that people might think about? Money, okay, sometimes people say we need to raise more money, right, to be able to solve this problem. All right, what else? Legislation. We need to pass policy, right, to be able to see the change that we want. What else? I'm sorry, say it again. Personal choice. We need people to make different decisions, right? Someone said revolution, right? We need a revolution, right? That's what I'm here to tell you about, all right? What else? Revolution, personal change, money. Yes, in the back. I just can't hear you, I'm sorry. Elections, right. We need to change the way elections work. We need to elect the right people into office. All right, what else? Understanding. What do you mean by that?
What they need.
We need to understand people. We need people to understand the issue, right? There are sort of all these different kind of things. Yes?
Intergovernmental cooperation.
Intergovernmental cooperation, right? A lot of the problems that we're facing nowadays are increasingly national, international problems, and so we need to think about the way different governmental units work. Yes, Tina?
Breaking down social boundaries so we can work together as a mass.
Breaking down social boundaries, right? So implicit, this is a great list, right? Implicit in all these ideas, right, is an assumption about what the problem is, right? If we are thinking that what we need to do is break down social boundaries, the assumption is that the problem is the fundamental problem that faces us are the divisions that exist between people, right? And so what I want to talk about a little bit is what are the kind of problems that you might need a movement to solve, right? Why do we, because it turns out, by the way, that building a movement, it's really hard, okay? That's the bad news for today, all right? It's not easy, and there's no formula to it, right? You're not going to walk out of here with a formula, right? So it's really hard, and there's no formula to it, sorry, all right? But so why would you do it, right? Why would you do it? So I sort of gave a few examples here of different solutions that I often hear people talk about when they talk about some of the social problems that they're facing, right? So one example that comes to mind is a lot of times I think people try to find technological fixes to the problems that we face, right? So the assumption there is that the fundamental problem is that we don't have the right skills or technologies to be able to solve the problems that we need to solve, right? And there are situations where that's the case. When we were trying to eradicate polio, right, what we needed was a vaccine. And once someone invented the vaccine, right, we're able to sort of solve the problem that's at stake, right? So there are certain problems that we can solve through new technologies, right? Sometimes, you can't see this on the screen, but sometimes, one of the solutions that I hear all the time, I teach community organizing to undergrads at the University of California, and the students' number one favorite solution to any problem that they have is to raise awareness, right? Oh, well, if we only raised awareness about that issue, then we'd solve it, right? And the fundamental assumption there is that this is a problem of information. If only people had the information, then they would know, right? And once they know, then they would act the way that we want them to act, right? And in fact, by the way, I'm sort of saying it a little facetiously, and I don't mean to undermine that, right? There are a lot of problems that we solve with information, right? You can think of, in the United States, doctors used to tell parents to put their babies to sleep on their backs, on their stomachs, right? Because they thought that was better for the baby. And then they discovered that it's much better for babies to sleep on their backs. And that was a situation where once they gave people the information, the parents the information, right, to have the babies sleep on their backs, parents made the change that they needed, right? And the reason why that worked was because the people who needed to make the change, right, had the authority and the power and the capacity to do it. Right? And they were motivated to do so, right? So if I'm a parent, there's nothing more that I want than my child to be healthy, right? And so when the doctor tells me it's better for you to put that baby to sleep on their back, I'm gonna do it, right? And I can do it. It's within my capacity to sort of make that change, okay? There are other problems, though, that aren't necessarily like that. And so one of the things that's really sexy right now in the United States is this whole idea of nudges, right? How can we sort of create market solutions or nudges that will change people's behavior, right, in a way that makes them behave the way that we want, right? And the assumption there is that the incentives aren't set up correctly, right? The incentives aren't set up for individuals or corporations or whoever it is that we're thinking about to act the way that we want them to act, right? And that's true in a lot of ways, right? It is true that the incentives aren't set up for people to live a fossil-free life, right? It's true that the incentives aren't set up for corporations to put the earth ahead of their profit, right? That's absolutely true, right? The problem with a lot of market solutions in the context of the work that all of us are doing, right, is that essentially what market solutions do is they replace the agency of people with the agency of the institutions that we create. Right? So instead of having the solution come from the people themselves, what we're trying to do is say, how can we use our agency as designers of policy, of institutions, as elites, right, to sort of design a world that will make people behave the way that we want them to behave, right? And so so that's fundamentally different, I would say, than the kind of problems that we're thinking about, which are problems of power. Right, and so in problems of power, right, you're facing a situation where a catchier message, right, one piece of technology, right, or one policy is not going to change the problem that you want to solve, right? The toughest problems that we face in our society, they're really, really sticky because they're fundamentally problems of power, right? There's situations where the reason why it's hard to make change is because there are people who have an incentive to maintain the status quo, right? And so when you have a problem of power, you have a situation where the people who need or want the change the most don't have the capacity to make that change, right? So it's very different from parents who want to sort of flip their babies onto their backs, right? Because they have the capacity to make that change. For those of us that are fighting for environmental justice, let's say, we don't have that capacity to make that change ourselves, right? So what we need is we have to figure out how we can work together, all of us, to acquire the resources that we need to make the change that we want. That's what a movement is about, right? A social movement is fundamentally about a group of people coming together, right, to figure out how can we take the resources that we have in this room, in this tent, Okay, how can we take the resources that we have and how can we reconfigure them in a way that allows us to make the change that we want, right? And that's what a movement does, essentially. A movement is figuring out how you reconfigure those resources. Okay, now sometimes when I talk about power, people are like, I don't know, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable, right? It makes me a little bit uncomfortable because when we talk about power, right, it makes people feel like we're fundamentally in an oppositional stance, right? We're fundamentally kind of creating conflict where you don't necessarily need to create conflict, right? And so one thing I want to just one point I want to make on that before I move on is this idea that power doesn't necessarily have to be conflictual, right? Like, what is power, right? One mistake I think that we often make is we think about power as a thing, right? I have my clicker, I have my power, I can't do that. I have my clicker, right? I have my clicker in this hand, and I have power over here, right? And so we think that power is like a thing that I can carry around, right? I'm gonna put it in my pocket, and I'm gonna walk into my meeting, right? And I've got that power, okay? That's not true. Power is not a thing, okay? What power is it's a relationship, right? And so in different instances, depending on what my relationship is with the people that I'm interacting with, I may or may not have power, right? So in this room right now, I've got power, right? Why do I have power? I've got the microphone, right? I can shout any of you down, okay? Unless Dennis shuts me off, right? So don't make Dennis mad. So Dennis has the power, okay? But right now, so I've got some power. Dennis has some power because he's controlling the microphone, okay? But if I were me, the same person, me, right? When I'm flying back to the United States tomorrow, and let's say my flight gets canceled, right? I'm dealing with United Airlines, all right? Who's got the power? Right? It's not me, right? It's United Airlines, but I'm the same person, right? So the same person in different contexts can have power or not have power, depending on what your relationship is, right? And what determines who has the power is a function of the interests and the resources of the people that we're interacting with, right? So power is fundamentally, it's an exchange of interests and resources. I talk with my hands. So it turns out it's hard to talk with my hands if you have a handheld mic. Okay, so it's an exchange of interests and resources, right? So I have power when the person that I'm interacting with has a set of interests, right? And my resources can help act on their interests, right? And they have power when I have interests and their resources can help act on my interests. Right? Now, when we're talking about creating power, we can either create power cooperatively together, that's power with, right? Or we can create power conflictually, oppositionally, right? That's power over. So there are instances, right, when I might want Tina to do something and she doesn't want to do it, so I have to use my resources to force her to change her interests. That's power over. Right? Or there are times when she and I, when we sit down, we might realize there's a mutually beneficial exchange of resources that we can create to create power with, right? And so just because we have problems of power doesn't mean that the people who have different interests from us are bad, right? It doesn't mean that they're evil, right? It just means that their interests are different from us, right? And we have to figure out how to create resources together that will make the change that we want. Okay? So what's the fundamentally most important resource you can have as a movement building organization? What's that? People. What kind of people? Active people, all right? Active people who, what's that? Active people who care, right? The currency of value in a movement is commitment, right? If I'm in a business, the currency of value is money, right? If I'm a professor, which I am, right, the currency of value is knowledge, right? In a movement, the currency of value is commitment, right? So what's the resource that we're trying to create? What's the resource that we're trying to build and grow and generate and create? It's commitment, right? We want people who have commitment, right? And so that's fundamentally the challenge of building a movement, right? So there's a famous organizer from the United States named Saul Alinsky from the 1960s. Some of you may have heard of him, right? And Saul Alinsky has this famous saying where he says, he's talking about American politics, right? In American politics, there are two sources of power, right? Organized people and organized money. And if you're not on the side of organized money, you better be on the side of organized people, okay? And so part of what I want to say today is that the problems that we're working on, most of us, I think, in this tent, the problems that we're working on, right, are problems of power, right? We're not on the side of organized money, so we've got to figure out how to be on the side of organized people, right? And what it means to organize people is to generate that currency of value commitment, is to generate that commitment, right? So how do we do that? Okay, so that's part 2. All right, so part 2, how do we generate commitment? All right, here's the answer, through transformation. All right, so how does that work? Okay, so a couple years ago, maybe in mid to late 2000s, I was thinking about different research projects, right? And I was looking around, and I was talking to a lot of the activists that I work with in different forms. And I was sort of finding a kind of a funny paradox in the conversations that I was having, all right? On the one hand, they were saying, wow, we're in this moment right now where we can get more people than ever before to get involved. It's amazing, right? With the new digital tools that we have, with the new technologies that we have, we can bring more people through the door than we ever have been able to before in human history, right? But then on the other hand, they were saying, but at the same time, even though we can get more people than ever to do more stuff, we feel like we're more powerless than we've ever been, right? And that was the paradox that I was trying to think about. Why is it that we're generating more activism, but we're not generating the kind of activism that feels like we're building power, right? And so what I do is I went and I set up a study that looked at the difference between organizations that were really, really good at generating the kind of committed activism, right, that builds power over time, and organizations that were not as good, okay? And I was trying to understand what was the difference between those organizations, right? And one of the things that became really clear in talking to a lot of the leaders that I was talking to is that there is a difference between, there are different models of organizing, there are different ways of getting people involved, right? And a term that kept coming up for me was the difference between mobilizing and organizing. Have you guys heard about that? Okay, so the difference between sort of transactional mobilizing, right, or transformational organizing, right? So what does that mean? So the difference between mobilizing and organizing, right, is fundamentally a difference between, are we trying to bring people in the door to match them with opportunities for involvement, right, wherever they come in through the door, or are we trying to fundamentally transform the people who walk in, right? And so if we imagine that in any of our organizations, right, those of you who run local Friends of the Earth chapters, those of you who are involved in other kinds of activist groups, you might imagine that there's like an activist ladder, right? And so for some of you it's probably explicit, and some of you maybe it's just sort of in your head, right? But you can all think about, well, there are those people that, you know, I was at a fair once and they came and they gave me their email address, right? And so they're on our list, right? But we've never seen them again, right? And then there are people who come every Wednesday to our general meeting, right? Or every Wednesday to sort of stuff envelopes or do whatever it is that we want them to do, right? And so within that activist ladder, what mobilizers would do is their job essentially is to find people out there who are already interested in getting involved with an organization like Friends of the Earth or whatever the organization is, right, and match them with opportunities for involvement. So if you come in and all you want to do is get on our list, great, we'll put you on our list, right? If you come in the door and you're ready to run your own group, great, we'll find an opportunity for you to exercise leadership, right? If you come in and you just want to run events for us, right, set up speakers once a month or something like that, great, we'll give you an opportunity to do that, right? That's mobilizing, okay? What organizers do, the difference is that organizers would say, wherever you come in the door, right, maybe you come in at the bottom of the ladder, maybe you come in at the top of the ladder, right, what we want to do is work with you, right, to cultivate your capacity, your motivation, your skills, your interests to be able to do more. We want to push you up that activist ladder, right? And the fundamental way in which organizers do that is by transforming people's sense of agency. Okay, what's agency? It's one of those words that academics use all the time, right? We make up words all the time, right? What is agency? It's power. Sorry, there's a lot of people talking at once. I can't hear.
Ability to act.
Ability to act, yep. Martin Luther King, right, famously defined agency as the ability to achieve purpose, right? I have agency when I can achieve my own purpose, okay? Now, here's one thing that's really interesting that I learned after I did this study, actually, right? political scientists, right, people like me, very often when they think about agency, they think about it as a feeling in our heads, right? Do I feel like I'm someone who can achieve my purpose, right? Efficacy, we think about it in those ways, right? Social psychologists, they define agency, right, as the combination of competence and autonomy, right? So why is that interesting, right? Because usually we think about agency as a feeling or a sense of whether or not I can achieve purpose, right? That's competence, right? But they're saying agency doesn't just come from whether or not you feel like you can do something. It also comes from whether or not you have the autonomy to act, right? And so what organizers do, right, is organizers, they're not only making people feel like they can do something, that they can achieve their purpose, right? They're giving volunteers, members, activists the autonomy to act, right? And that was one of the things that was so interesting to me when I was doing this study, is that the difference between mobilizing and organizing, it wasn't just semantic, right? It wasn't just words, right? But organizers and mobilizers fundamentally did different things, right? So for example, mobilizers, when, the way that they would structure their work was very different from how organizers would structure their work, right? Mobilizers would, very often the authority was centralized, right, in the hands of a few staff, right? And the staff were always pushing out opportunities for involvement, just trying to get people involved, right? So that's just sort of trying to bring people in the door, right? Organizers, they would distribute responsibility and autonomy out to the grassroots, right? Why is that? Because that's how you give people autonomy, right? That's how you give people the autonomy to develop and exercise their own agency, right? The kinds of asset they would make were different, right? Mobilizers, what they want to do is they want to get as many people as possible to do as much stuff as they can. What's the easiest way to do that? Is to let people act alone, right? I teach hundreds of undergrads all the time, and every time I give them a group project, it's like, oh my God, Professor Han, we have to do a group project. Like, I have to work with another human being, Please no, right? And so it's like working with other people, it's a real pain in the butt, it turns out, right? You have to coordinate, you have to collaborate, we have different schedules, you have to negotiate agreement, right? And so mobilizers, when they're trying to get as many people as possible to do more stuff, right, they would generate tasks where people could work as independently as possible. Right? And that's how you get more people to do more stuff. Organizers, in contrast, they were constantly trying to find ways to put people into relationship with others. Right? And that relationship, it can be digital or it can be offline, right? So I want to be really clear that the difference between mobilizing and organizing is not a technological difference. Right? You can put people into relationship with each other online, right? Just like you can in a face-to-face meeting. All right, but they were constantly looking for opportunities to do that, right? And so there are all sorts of differences like that I thought were really interesting between mobilizing and organizing. And part of what was really interesting about mobilizing and organizing, the reason why you needed the transformation to build that power, is because if you're only mobilizing, right, you're only getting some of the people that you can get. There's a fruit tree, so imagine a tree, right? And there's low-hanging fruit and there's high-hanging fruit, okay? Does that analogy translate? Okay. There's low-hanging fruit and there's high-hanging fruit, right? The low-hanging fruit, right, are the people who are the easiest to get, right? Those are the people that if you design the right message, right, the correct meme, right, you generate the right event, you're going to get those people in the door, right? Because they're already motivated for some reason to get involved with your issue. You just need to find them. Right? And we have more tools now than we've ever had before to be able to find them, right? That's the low-hanging fruit, right? But if you're only getting the low-hanging fruit, you're never building the kind of change that you need, right? Because to build the kind of change that we need, we have to get that middle and that high-hanging fruit, right? And those are the people that maybe they could care less about your issue, right? Maybe they care about it, but they don't have the capacity to act on it, right? Maybe they work 2 jobs, right? Maybe they've got kids. Right? Maybe they have none of those things, right? So there's all these ways in which to get to the higher hanging fruit, we have to begin to work on transformation. Now, what was really interesting to me about the work that I did was when I looked at these organizations, the organizations that were the most consistently able to generate the kind of activism that they needed to build power were the organizations not just that did mobilizing, right? Or the organizations that just did organizing. It was the organizations that did both. Right? You had to do both the mobilizing and the organizing. And the reason for that is because mobilizing, it builds breadth. Okay, breadth, this way, both ways, okay? But the organizing, it builds depth, right? And so you need both as an organization, right? You have to get to you need the breadth to be able to get to the scale that you want, right? But you need depth to have that leadership core that continually generates that commitment, right? And it's a renewable resource, right? The great thing about commitment, right, is that it's a renewable resource. It's not like there's a finite amount of commitment out there in the world, right? We can continue to build more and more and more and more, all right? So organizations, they needed both mobilizing and organizing. All right, you guys with me? All right, so last piece, so then love. Why love, right? We talked about power, right? Why is it that we're working on problems of power? Second, why do we need transformation? That was part 2. All right, part 3, why do we need love? Okay, so why do we need love to create transformational change? So let's step back, right? This moment that we're in, right? I hate to put a picture of Donald Trump up there. I know, I'm so sorry. At the beginning, when I first did this talk, he was the last slide, okay? But then I was like, ooh, I can't end on such a bad note, right? And so I moved him up a little, all right? Okay, so this moment that we're in, right? All around the world, right? All over the world, we're seeing these trends come out, right? You can call it what you want, right-wing populism, Trumpism, whatever it is that you want to call it, right? We're seeing this in this moment, right? We're facing a challenge, right? That's different from other challenges that we faced before, right? There are different ways to interpret this moment, right? I think one way to interpret it is that we as a world, right, we as a society, we're in a moment of great uncertainty, right? The economy is changing, our politics are changing, right? And whenever you have moments of great uncertainty, right, people are looking around to try to figure out, where do I fit in this new world, right? What happens to me in this new economy, in this new society that we're creating? Right? And what we're seeing, at least in the United States, and certainly I think in all over the world, is that, you know, with the sort of rise of people like Donald Trump, right, we're seeing this outpouring of resistance, right? The Sierra Club, which is a big environmental organization in the United States, right, in the month after Trump was elected, they got more members joining in the month of November, right, than they had in the previous 6 years. Right? In 30 days, they got more people than they had in 6 years combined, okay? So we're seeing this outpouring of resistance, right? But the challenge is, right, one of my mentors is someone named Marshall Gans, who's a longtime organizer and now teaches organizing in the Kennedy School. And he sort of says, the challenge that we have in this moment, right, is how do we turn unity in the face of resistance into unity in the face of common purpose, right? And the challenge is that right now, what a lot of the resistance work is doing, right, or what a lot of these organizations that are just fed up with this moment that we're in, right, is we're just relying on that low-hanging fruit, right? What we're doing is we're just relying on people who self-select into our movement, right, because there's so many of them, right? The Sierra Club got 6 times more members, right, in that 1 month than they did in the past year. Why would we need more? Right? Well, the reason why we need more is because if we only rely on those who self-select into our movement, we're never going to be able to sort of create the transformation that we need, right? We're never going to be able to sort of create, right, the kind of shared purpose that transcends beyond the people who already agree with us, right? And honestly, right, I'm so glad to see all you guys here, because I don't think there's any way out of this moment that we're in other than organizing, right? I firmly believe that in my heart, right? That like the only way we're gonna see our way out of this is to organize the communities that we live in, right? So where does love fit into this, right? So sometimes I go and I do these talks and people are like, so you went, like you looked at these organizations and they did this like transformational work, like what does that mean, right? Does it really work? Okay, so let me just sort of tell you one story, or 2 stories, right? So the first is, there's a sociologist named Ziad Munson. If you've ever heard me talk before, you've probably heard me talk about him. I should be his agent, okay? And so he did this study once about pro-life activists in the United States, right? And this really interesting study where he wanted to go out and find out, how did people who are at the very front lines of the pro-life movement, how did they get drawn into the movement, right? Where did that commitment come from? Right? And one of the things that's so interesting that he found was that normally we assume, who are the people that are drawn into the pro-life movement, right? It's people who believe in pro-life issues, right? Who's drawn into the environmental movement? People who want to protect the earth, right? Seems logical, okay? What he found was that of the people who are at the very, can you not even see this probably? Okay. There are actually 10 people on that screen, okay? 5 of them are light green, all right? What he found was that of the people who were leaders in the frontline movement, of the leaders in the pro-life movement, right? These are people who run local groups in their communities, who attend rallies, marches, they stand outside clinics, harassing women who were trying to walk in, okay? What he found was that when they first joined the movement, 47% of them, right, almost half, 47% of them were either pro-choice or indifferent to issues of abortion, right? That 47% of them, when they first joined the pro-life movement, they didn't even believe in pro-life issues. Okay, so that should give you pause, right? Because that meant the people that they were bringing in the door didn't even agree with them on an issue, right? Maybe they came because they just joined a new church and they wanted to get to know people, right? Maybe they came because they just retired and all of a sudden they had more free time, right? Maybe they came because a friend asked them to come to the meeting and they felt bad saying no, right? But what's profoundly interesting to me is there are a lot of meetings that I'll go to once, right? But what made them come back, right? What happened in that first meeting that made them come back, right? If they were pro-choice, right? Or if they were indifferent to issues of abortion. Yeah, is there a question? Oh, the question was, were they purposefully all female? Yeah, no, those are just my icons, and I always choose female icons if I can. No, it was both men and women. Although I think there are more women in the pro-life that are leaders at this stage in the pro-life movement. But yeah, that was not an intentional choice. Thank you for clarifying. So what happened in that meeting? Right, I'm not going to come back to a meeting where I feel hated. Right, I'm not going to come back to a meeting where I feel disrespected for my views. Right, they came back to that meeting, right, because there was some foundation of trust, right, there was some foundation of community, right, that made them come back even if they weren't sure if they believed in the issue, right, and they came back again and again and again until they were transformed not only in what they believed, right, but also transformed in what they felt they must do because of what they believe, right, so not only did I move from being pro-choice to pro-life, right, I also began to think, wow, I've got to put my time into working on this to fight for what I believe in, right? That's commitment, right? And so in some ways, like at the core of a lot of what I think all of us are trying to do, or the challenge that we're facing, more so in this moment than we've ever kind of faced before, is this question of how do we do that transformative work, right? And that kind of transformation. Right, the kind of transformation that we need to heal the divides that we see in this present moment, it doesn't happen without love. Right? Organizers have a term called agitation. Right? I can't agitate somebody unless we have this foundation of trust. Right? I can't agitate someone unless we have the love in place. Right? But is that kind of love possible? Right? Day after the election, I remember, the election was on a Tuesday, the U.S. election, right? The day after the U.S. election, it was on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, I was supposed to get on a plane to Berlin, actually, ironically, okay? And I remember being in the airport on that Wednesday morning. I was devastated. I hadn't slept. I was exhausted, right? My heart was broken, right? And I looked around at the airport. All of a sudden, I thought, oh my gosh, half of these people voted for Trump, right? And I felt scared. And I thought in that moment, that's the wrong reaction to have, right? Because if I continue having that reaction, all that's going to do is exacerbate the problems that we already have, right? So let me finish by telling you, oh, sorry, I went longer than I meant to. Let me finish by telling you one more story. Okay, so when I first started doing the project that I just sort of talked to you about, it was, I started thinking about it kind of in like 2008, 2009. I started collecting data around April of 2010, okay? And I was pregnant at the time with our second child. And my husband and I, we named our second child Kaesong, which is after the town Kaesong, right? Which is a town that is right on the border of North and South Korea, right? And Kaesong has special meaning in our family. The reason why we named our son this, because Kaesong was a site where they first began peace negotiations to end the Korean War, and those peace negotiations failed, and they eventually moved them to Pyongyang, which is where they finished the negotiations. It also was the town where my grandfather saw his mother for the last time. Right, when they were migrating south from North Korea to South Korea, he went to Kaesong to say goodbye to his mother, not knowing the country was going to split and he'd never see her again. Right, and so that name, that town, it means a lot to our family because it reminds us that peace is a struggle. Right, that peace doesn't come easily to us as people. We have to work for it. And it turned out to be a really important name for our baby because that baby died. right? The baby died right at birth. And I remember in the hospital, right, when the doctor said those words to me, your baby has died. Okay, your baby has died, right? And in that moment, I felt this like blackness come over me, right? And I felt like it was a blackness that I never find my way out of, right? But I did, right? I'm here before you, okay? And the way that I found my way out is that I realized something several months after he had died, right? What I realized is that the flip side of grief is love, right? You don't grieve for someone that you don't love. Yet, I loved this person who I never really met. I never heard him speak. I have no idea what kind of person he would become. I never heard him laugh, right? But I loved him fully and completely with every fiber of my being, right? And if I can love a complete stranger, right, that fundamentally changes the way that I see the world, right? Because I could love this person that I never met, right? And so if I can love someone that I never really got to know, I can love this person who's sitting right in front of me, right? Even if that person disagrees with me, right? And so in some ways, and I remember I had gone out to start collecting data on this project a month before Kaesong was born, right? He was born in full term at 40 weeks, and I thought, you know what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go out and like get all the data collection pieces in place, and then I'm gonna have this baby, and I'm gonna take 6 months off. That's what we do in the United States, right? I'm gonna take 6 months off, and I'm gonna be with this baby, and then I'm gonna go back, and all the data will be collected, right? And so the wheels were already in motion for this project by the time Kaesong died. I didn't know he was gonna die, right? And so in the beginning, I thought, I really can't believe I've got to like go back and work on this project, right? But then as I began to realize these lessons about love, right, I began to see how they informed the work that I was doing, right? And so in some ways I feel like Kaesong gave us a great gift, right? Because even in his absence, I learned something fundamental about the world that we're doing, about the work that we're building. And so in August of 2011, 16 months after Kaesong died, my husband and my daughter, who was 3 at the time, we welcomed our third child into the world, right? And he was born. I think that we were all, you know, when he was born, we were all sort of grateful for the sort of gift that we had been given with his life, right? We had a greater sense of the fragility of his life. And so the sound that you're hearing right now, right, is his heartbeat, our third son. And my cousin, my very talented cousin, Dan Green, who also makes guitars, by the way, for any of you who want a guitar, he put the heartbeat to music for us, right? And I carry this with me on my phone, right? Our phones are amazing. I can carry my son's heartbeat with me, right? And I listen to it sometimes when I'm not sure what to do, right? And I invite you to just take a moment to listen to the sound. Right? Is there anything that's more fundamental to our humanity than the beating of a child's heart? Right? And it's that heartbeat, right, that has to be at the core of everything that we do, right? Because unless we recognize the dignity of everybody, right, we all have the same heartbeat, right? People who disagree with us, people who voted for Trump, people who voted for Brexit, right? People who support Marine Le Pen, right? We all have that same heartbeat, right? And unless we recognize that dignity, we're not going to build the movement that we need, right? And so that's the final lesson that I want to leave you with, right? Is that at the core of the power that we need to build, right, at the core of the transformation that we need to make, right, are these heartbeats, right? And so, I don't even know if you can see it, but the last image I have on there is just this image of a road that's winding into a place that we don't know, right? We're in this moment of uncertainty. We don't know where it's going to go, right? But I'm really grateful to be on this journey, and I thank you all for coming out this morning and letting me sort of share this journey with you for a few moments, and I look forward to any questions and conversation that you guys want to have. Thank you.